Hi everyone, welcome back to Fresh Parchment. Today I am here to wrap up the 12 books that I read of my very ambitious July TBR pile. This was probably achieved because I participated in 2 readathons this month and that spurred me on quite a lot. So let's dive in and see what I read. So the first 2 books I read were books from a challenge that I have set myself for the year of 2020, and that is to read at least 1 nonfiction book and 1 classic book per month. So for nonfiction this July, I wanted something a little lighter and a little bit more fun. So I picked up Tall Tales and Wee Stories by Billy Connolly, which is a book that he developed through last year after he retired from stand-up comedy. And it's a collection of all of his best and favorite stand-up routines, written down almost exactly the way he says them. And I was worried that they wouldn't come across as funny on paper as they do in the clips and the films of shows that I've seen over the years. They were just as funny. I loved this book. And I think Potatoes of the Night is my particular favorite because I had never seen him perform that. Quite honestly, anytime I saw a clip labeled Potatoes of the Night, I thought it was a video that someone had made up. But no, it's a real stand-up routine that he wrote. It is hilarious. If you're at all familiar with Billy Connolly, or if you're not familiar with his comedy routines, I highly encourage you to pick this up. The next book I read was my classic of the month, which was a collection of 3 novellas by the French author Colette. Now, you may have heard of some of her works more recently because there was the film made about her 2 years ago starring Keira Knightley, which is a wonderful film, and that's how I came to her as an author. You may also know the first novella in this collection, which is Gigi, which was turned into a successful Broadway musical and film in the 50s and 60s, which was one I grew up on as a child. It's very different reading about it as an adult. You realize all of the different layers that are in that story that you don't necessarily pick up on as a child. It also has 2 other novellas in it, Julie de Carnelin, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, I really don't know, let me know if I'm not, and Chance Acquaintances. I find Colette a very interesting author in that I admire her so much as a person because she lived so bravely for the early 1900s. She was, I hesitate to say openly bisexual because there's no way that anyone could have been, but she was as openly bisexual as one could have been at that time. She tried out many different careers throughout the course of her life, and she wrote prolifically, including having to come out from under the thumb of her husband for rights to her own works. However, I find a lot of her books very hard to connect with. She writes about such unlikable heroines. And I don't necessarily mind that. I like reading from different perspectives, especially well-known stories from the villain's perspective. I can get behind that. But I found it very hard to really understand what some of their motivations were. What did they really want out of life, especially with Julie de Carnelin. I found that very, very difficult. Gigi I enjoyed very, very much. I found it just as pleasing as the Broadway musical, perhaps a little bit better. There are a few things in the musical that are a little bit off-putting as an adult. Overall, I liked it. I'm glad I read it, but I'm not entirely sure how I feel about them, and she's not up there as one of my favorites. Let me know if you've had a similar experience with her work. The next thing I participated in was Jane Austen July, run by Katie from Books and Things and Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, and I will link both of their channels down below. And I completed 4 challenges for Jane Austen July, and I will tell you all about those. The first was to read some sort of a Jane Austen spin-off book. And for that prompt, I read Dangerous Alliance by Yenneker Cohen, which is not necessarily a spin-off of one particular Austen novel, It follows Lady Victoria Ashton, who is a huge fan of Jane Austen's 4 novels that have been published by the time this novel takes place. I believe it takes place in the end of 1816, maybe early 1817. Even though Jane Austen is still writing anonymously, Lady Victoria says that, well, everyone in our area of Hampshire knew it was really Jane Austen, which is a little bit of a stretch, but at least they acknowledge that Jane did not have the huge amount of fame that she does now when she first started writing. And I wasn't entirely sure how I would feel about this book. It could have taken so many liberties with the time period, Austen's writing itself, with the mores of Regency society. At this point, you will have seen how huge my nonfiction collection about Austen and the Regency is. So those type of things really do bother me, even if it is in a YA or a children's book. And I found this actually quite good fun. It's very gripping, and I flew through it, and it was quite an enjoyable ride, and it was much better researched than I expected it to be, which was a pleasant surprise, and that'll teach me to be quite as snobbish as I have been. Lady Victoria is the younger sister of a manor house somewhere in Hampshire. Very independent, very intellectual, but one day her sister comes home and her family discovers that her sister's husband is not the good husband that they thought he was going to be. And now the inheritance is in danger, which means Lady Victoria has to find a husband as soon as she can in order to save her family's estate. She tries to use Jane Austen's novels as a guide to finding that wonderful husband. But can fiction really help guide you through reality? So overall, not a terrific read, not 5 stars, but still quite fun and quite enjoyable. The next challenge I was able to fulfill was to read a nonfiction book about Austen or Austen's times, and for this I was able to pick up An Elegant Madness by Venetia Murray. And I'm ashamed to say how many years this has sat on my TBR, but I finally read it, and I'm very glad that I did. This is nonfiction about Regency society, but strictly high Regency society. So this is looking at the lives of the Prince Regent, Lord Byron, Caroline Lamb, very high profile and very wealthy Regency celebrities, essentially, and the way that they lived their lives and the traditions that they would have followed or indeed broken, the scandals that would have ensued. So Jane Austen wouldn't have participated in any of these events herself, nor would any of her characters, but they all certainly would have been cognizant of them. And again, I really enjoyed this. It could have gotten very dry and very boring, but Venetia Murray made sure to inject sly little witticisms every now and again in a very Austenian way to really pep up the reading material and make it as fun as it should be. Because quite honestly, talking about Regency gossip columns should be as fun as reading an actual gossip column. So if you're at all interested in Austen and the times that she lived in, I would highly recommend adding this to your TBR pile. The next challenge I was able to complete was to read something by Austen that is not one of her major 6 novels. So for this, I picked up the Illustrated Letters of Jane Austen, which was selected and introduced by Penelope Hughes Hallett. This is a beautiful edition. It's not all of Jane Austen's letters. I do own a full collection as well. But the reason I bought this was really for the beautiful illustrations that are included on almost every page to accompany the various letters that Hughes Hallett has included in this volume. It's divided into sections according to where Jane Austen was living at a particular time, and includes little footnoted bits at the bottom of every letter explaining certain references that were made to a variety of people that we, as modern readers, might not understand. The letters themselves are always very enjoyable, and the illustrations were beautiful and well chosen. I did have an issue, however, with whoever the editor for this volume was. There were so many spelling errors, typos, spacing errors that I found very distracting and felt a little bit sloppy to me. And they could have been so easily avoided. It didn't dampen my enjoyment of the letters themselves, but it did draw me out of the cozy mindset that I fall into whenever I read Jane Austen. It's a slight quibble, I know, but it is something that I noticed, and I hope in the other volume about Jane Austen's bath that there are not those kinds of errors, because I'm really looking forward to reading that one at some point. The last challenge I was able to fulfill for Jane Austen July was to read a novel written by one of Jane Austen's contemporaries. So for this, I was able to read Belinda by Maria Edgeworth. Belinda is about the titular heroine, Belinda, who goes to stay with a friend of the family, Lady Delacour, in London, because her aunt is desperate to get her married off, as she's married off all of her sisters and cousins, and yet Belinda remains unmarried. So her aunt thinks, well, maybe Lady Delacour will be able to help and, bring her into the correct circles of society. The more Belinda gets drawn into the society, the more dissatisfied she becomes with it, and the more outlandish characters she meets who try to foil her chances at romance every step of the way. I found it very interesting in a lot of ways, foremostly in that it is the most diverse classic I have read so far, especially from so early on in the novel's history. There is a character of mixed race, there is a black slave who is given a speaking role, and there is a woman who could be categorized as trans. I'm not entirely sure. There's definitely a queer element somewhere going on, possibly. However, the way those diverse characters are handled is not the best way. And I realize it was over 200 years ago, so yes, there was a lot of progress to be made in terms of the treatment of characters of color and queer characters. I understand that. But it still made me a little bit uncomfortable reading about it. And even some of the characters that you're not meant to really like for example, Lady Delacour, who is extremely witty to the detriment of everything else. She doesn't know how to bring herself down to earth and consider things from a calm and a rational and a human perspective. She wears her wittiness like an armor. And towards the beginning, I could even find that very interesting and enjoyable to read. But the further on I got, by about the 300-page mark, no one had really changed. We barely hear from Belinda herself. We hear from all of the characters around her, rather than her speaking for herself. And yet she's meant to be this transformative figure in so many people's lives. And I just couldn't quite buy into that, given that we don't see her interacting truly with very many of her surrounding friends. I did not buy into the romance at the end. I didn't buy into either of the romances really, but especially the way it ended up. I didn't care about any of the characters after the 300-page mark. I just wanted them to get on with it and wrap it up, which I'm very disappointed about because I know Jane Austen loved this novel and she admired Maria Edgeworth as an author. So I was really hoping to love it a little bit more than I did. Next up in my slew of readathons in which I participated was the Reading Rush, which ran from July 20th to the 26th. And in that week I managed to read 4 different books. The first book that I read was Liaison Dangerous by Pierre Chaudelot de Laclos, which is about 2 French aristocrats, the Vicomte de Valmont and the Marquis de Merteuil, who are former lovers themselves. They are now challenging each other to seduce various other members of their acquaintance. This is told in an epistolary form, which I did not expect. I was familiar with the storyline as I read the play adapted by Christopher Hampton when I was 16 or 17, I believe. And I fell in love with it. I absolutely adored it. This is an incredible insider look at pre-revolutionary French aristocratic society. It is deeply funny. It is incredibly gripping. All of the characters are so human. You can see through any of the artifices that they try to put up. And yet some part of you hopes that maybe some of their lies are true so that they can actually be happy. I had no idea that this caused such a stir when it was first published. I'm not sure that it was banned, but it was certainly held up, I suppose, in a similar way that 50 Shades of Grey was, that it was the most shocking thing that anyone had ever read. For 18th century literature, it speaks quite frankly about all sorts of sexual encounters that the main characters have, both men and women. So I have come to the conclusion that I love this novel in any form that it takes. If I ever got my hands on a time machine, I would take it back to the 1980s in order to see the original cast of the stage adaptation, which was Lindsay Duncan and Alan Rickman as the Marquise and the Vicomte, respectively. So yes, I was so pleased with this. It was such fun to read, and I have a feeling I may end up rereading it in the future as well, which is rare, but I'm very much looking forward to when I do. The next book I read for the reading rush was Tulip Fever by Deborah Mogok, and this filled several of the prompts, but mainly it filled the prompt to read a book of which you have already seen the movie. And I saw the film Tulip Fever back when it came out 2 or 3 years ago, and got all the way through the film without realizing that it was also a novel. So I've finally gotten my hands on a secondhand copy, and I loved this. I gave it 5 stars, which is very rare for me. Tulip Fever is about Sophia, who's the young wife of an older Dutch merchant. And they have been trying for children for a while, and Sophia feels relatively trapped. However, her husband decides to call in a young painter and have their portrait painted, since it's all the rage and it will preserve them and make them immortal, the same way in that passing your genes on to a child would. And as soon as the painter enters their lives, things will never be the same. And Sophia and Jan, the painter, are drawn into more and more intrigue and lies, and it gets more and more tense, such that it truly reads like a thriller. The film is paced like a thriller, and the book reads exactly the same way. And it's stunning not just because of the pace and the grip, but the writing is beautiful. The writing is absolutely stunning without being flowery. So this is another book I can absolutely see myself rereading, holding on to forever. I absolutely adored it, and I highly recommend it. The next book I read for the reading rush was Kim Ji-young, born 1982, by Cho Nam-ju, and translated by Jamie Chang. This was originally written in Korean, and this book created a huge stir in South Korea only a year or 2 ago when it was first published. It uses a Jane Doe type figure. Kim Ji-young was the most popular name for girls in 1982 and indeed the early 80s in general. So it uses her as kind of a Jane Doe figure, symbolic of all women who are now in their 30s in South Korea, and follows her from childhood to adulthood, chronicling all of the micro and sometimes macro aggressions that she has had to deal with simply for being female. I found this book absolutely fascinating. I found it infuriating, which proves that it did its job beautifully in pointing out all of the double standards. I wasn't sure what I thought of the style at first, because it's very clinical and very cut and dry. In fact, this is the only fiction book I've ever read that includes footnotes to actual scholarly articles and newspaper articles that prove the particular points that Cho Nam-ju includes. But I wasn't sure what to do with the rest of the very clinical and cut and dry style. I wasn't sure if there was a reason for that style, if that is typical of Korean literature, if her tone got lost in translation. But you discover why the tone is so clinical and so cut and dry in the epilogue, which took me on a roller coaster ride in and of itself. The narrator is revealed, and that very minimalist tone makes sense. And then you start following their thought process, and you suddenly think, oh my goodness, wait, this thought process is it supporting the whole point of the rest of the novel? Is it undermining it? And then there's a twist right at the end that, for me, made it all worth it. I would highly recommend this book. It's very short, very quick and easy read, but it is fascinating for so many reasons. I really enjoyed it. And the last book I read for the reading rush was The Glove Maker by Anne Weisgarber, which I no longer have a copy of since I sent it to a dear, dear friend of mine, which I'll talk about in a moment. So The Glove Maker is about Deborah, woman in her 30s, living in the town of Junction in Utah, which was a tiny, tiny Mormon enclave out in the middle of canyon country. And it's January, and she is waiting for her husband to return. Her husband is a wheelwright, and he's been down south peddling his trade, and he's late. He should have been home right now, and he's not. And so she's very tense, waiting and wondering and hoping that he will return. But in the middle of all of this, a stranger shows up at her door who's on the run from the law, and she decides to help him. But slowly and surely that decision starts to involve the rest of the town as well and draw them all deeper and deeper into danger. Well, it's advertised as a mystery, but to me it read more like a thriller. It was very good at historical fiction, since it does follow an LDS community. P.S. LDS stands for Latter-day Saint, which is the preferred term for who we would normally think of as Mormons. Since it follows an LDS community, I wasn't entirely sure how it was going to deal with that subject, since, as far as I can tell, the author is not a Latter-day Saint herself. From what I know of LDS history, I think that it did a pretty good job. However, I've sent it to my dear, dear friend, like I said, because A, we could all use some different reading material these days, and B, she is also LDS. So I'm very intrigued to get her perspective on how the novel used the history and how accurate it is. The last two books I read in July were not attached to any readathon. They were just books that I was looking forward to reading and picked up just on a whim. The first of those is The Girls of Riyadh by Raja Al-Sanea. It was pitched to me as imagine Sex and the City, but set in Saudi Arabia, which I couldn't quite picture based on that tagline, but it really is accurate. This follows 4 friends who are all living in Riyadh and going to school and navigating new relationships and getting married, and all of the trouble that they face both in Saudi society and if they move outside of Saudi society, and the balance of living within a theocracy and then living outside of it. It was fun, it was fascinating, it wasn't brilliantly written, but I did enjoy the anonymous author structure. This book is written as a series of what would now be blog posts, but at the time, a single young woman is writing each chapter as kind of a short story, and then emailing that story out to a massive mailing list in Riyadh and the surrounding area. So you often get to hear from her perspective, and you know that people are contacting her in return with their theories about these characters, and is the author one of these 4 girls, and if so, which one is she? And addressing things that have been said in the news in Saudi society or other books from Saudi authors. And I really, really enjoyed it. It was good fun, it was fascinating. Like I said, not high literature, but very, very entertaining. And the last book that I read this month, which I finished up yesterday, was The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, which is actually the first Toni Morrison I've ever read. And luckily, I really enjoyed it, so I will be looking into more of her books in the future. The Bluest Eye follows a variety of characters, but the focus starts on 3 young girls, one of whom is Piccola Breedlove, who has internalized society's standards of beauty to such a degree that all she wants and all she thinks that she needs to be beautiful is blonde hair and blue eyes. And it looks at all of the ways in which pervasive and systemic racism have destroyed not only these children's lives, but the lives of the adults around them, and how it just carries on destroying from generation to generation. It is a stunning read, stylistically, thematically. I hesitate to say that I enjoyed it because the subject matter is so dark, but it needs to be. It needs to be in order to get its point across. So I would highly recommend this one as well, and I'm looking forward to picking up Beloved at some point in the future, because that is here on my TBR stack, so I can get to that one next. So there we have it. Those were the 12 books that I read in July. Let me know down below if you had similar experiences with any of the books that I read, if you had different opinions on any of them. I would love to know. And if you have any recommendations to me based on what I enjoyed or what I didn't enjoy. And until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.